Goldman Sachs and some other Wall Street banks are considering rolling out Bitcoin-backed loans. This is according to sources that spoke to CoinDesk's Ian Allison. This would be an interesting move from some of the biggest banks on Wall Street to let clients use Bitcoin as loan collateral. It's something that we see in some of the smaller, more crypto-friendly banks, notably Silvergate and Signature have rolled this out earlier this year. But for Goldman Sachs and other Wall Street titans, JP Morgan, maybe, to be considering this is certainly notable. So just wanted to touch on this and throw this to the crowd. David, I'm going to pick on you because I love your sweater. What's going on with this? What do you see when you see headlines such as Goldman considering getting into the Bitcoin lending game?
So I'm going to have sort of a boomer take on this one, which is you can see the attraction for a bank like Goldman. There's obviously a lot of this collateral out there, and they earn fees when they issue these loans. So, it's money for them, and that's what they're there to chase after. But if you are Gary Gensler or you're somebody who's looking at this from a systemic perspective, then you start to worry a little bit because however you feel about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, they are still highly speculative assets. And even though, Goldman in theory would be protected if there's a big drawdown, for example, I'm sure you get margin called on these loans if your collateral sinks. But as this spreads, you then have Bitcoin becoming a more systemic element of the financial system. And that's a sort of a systemic risk. This would be great for Bitcoin for sure. But from a financial system perspective, there are, I think, some questions that it raises in terms of what regulators and bigwigs would be worried about. So that's my initial thought. I saw Will nodding his head.
Yeah, I'll pick up kind of the point you're putting down there. I think when you're looking at like the loan to value ratio on these things, I would expect it to be pretty high. Like you're going to have a really high margin on these things, and like the interest rate also might be kind of bearing within that. That it might be a little bit higher for someone who's willing to take out a loan based on Bitcoin they hold and loaning that out to Goldman Sachs or whoever. Zach, one thing I do want to touch on in the article for those of us who are not in the nitty-gritty banking world is this tri-party repo conversation that's happening here in the article. Can you kind of walk us through like what would this loan look like in practice?
Yeah, that part was crazy for me too, because I'm definitely not in the weeds of the banking world. But my understanding is that tri-party repo arrangements are like you agree to sell shares and then repurchase them under certain terms, I guess as a way to limit risk. So the way that this would be structured would be like similarly complex in terms of financial instruments that these firms use in the world of traditional finance all the time. Because, the interesting thing is here is like, okay, how do I do this without necessarily touching the Bitcoin itself? So they're trying to figure out these arrangements that sort of speak the language of Wall Street. And that's my understanding of that nitty gritty. But, David, if you know anything about tri-party repo, if you know anything about that,
absolutely
feel free to take that one. Okay.
Unfortunately.
I'll jump in with something else though. It's interesting when they're talking about dealing with cryptocurrency and using it as collateral to hand out loans. They're talking about having a third party handle all of this. Now, Brian Brooks, when he was comptroller of the currency, actually gave guidance that said banks can handle these assets. It's totally fine. Now, they are exploring this option of giving out loans using crypto as collateral because Brian also outlined that it's like cash. And so basically they're free to treat it as such. And it's interesting that they're kind of taking half of his guidance and not the other half. They're still really not comfortable with dealing with custodying the asset itself, where they actually have full permission to do so. Given like a lot of the things that Brian actually ruled, he was only in office for a short amount of time and got through a lot of legislation. And it's interesting because a lot of it was actually frozen. As soon as the new comptroller of the currency was put into place, everything was kind of put on hold. It's like, let's analyze this. And so now there is some strange uncertainty with some of the stuff regarding crypto, because although like anything issued by the comptroller of the currency, that is the final word in that. That is the kind of the highest position when it comes to regulating the banking industry. So his word kind of goes into effect. And regardless, you kind of got this weird situation where some things are frozen and there's still uncertainty and maybe there'll be new guidance. So it's like, I think that the banks are playing it careful here, because there just hasn't been much clarity from this new administration about what's actually in effect and what isn't. But I'll throw it over to you, Zach.
I think that's a really smart point. And I think just, zooming out even further, right? I think you could view this entire sort of regulatory, teeth gnashing that's going on in DC as, all right, how do we make it so the banks can handle this stuff, right? How do we make it so that it comports with existing regulations so that big players like Goldman Sachs and others can have access to this asset class in a meaningful way? And when you think about that future for what Bitcoin could look like, we've seen dribs and drabs of this over the course of this bull run. When you think about that future of just Bitcoin as just any other asset class that Wall Street touches on the daily basis, becomes really interesting to think about what the future of all these things ends up being. But for another day, there'll be plenty of time to unpack those big thoughts.